I appreciate that so many of you have taken the time out of your lunch break to come here this afternoon. And I also know that there are some others watching online from other sites. I think I have either met or that you've seen me before, but for those of you who don't know, I'm Chancellor Bernadette Gray-Little. And this is my first budget forum here at KU, but unfortunately there have been several budget forums this year. I think there have been 4 already in the past year on this campus, and there have been other budget forums in Kansas City and at other sites. So the economy has certainly been on our minds and part of our conversation for the last several months. I have brought reinforcements with me today, and so let me introduce them. Here, Interim Provost Danny Anderson on my right, and on my left, State Relations Director Kathy Damron, and then over on the other end, Vice Provost for Finance Diane Goddard, who will in turn make some contributions to our discussion today. We want to share with you information that we have about the state budget and about the effects that the state's budget crisis have on KU, and also to answer your questions. If you're watching online, you can send your questions to chancellor@ku.edu, and we will respond to you by email. You can also learn more about the state budget if you want background information by clicking the Budget News link on the KU homepage. So that's ku.edu, and go to the Budget News link. As all of you know, the state is facing unprecedented economic challenges. I think the governor said at one point that in the past several decades there had not been 2 straight years of revenue declines. But unfortunately, those times are over, and next year we are projected to have what will be the 4th year of decline. As you can see from the handout, and I think all of you have received that as you came in, this would be the handout that looks like this. The state revenues, which shows state revenues from 2006 to today. From 2006, 2007 to 2008, you see healthy increases in the state budget, and then a really precipitous change from fiscal year 2008 to 2009, which would be shown here. And then in the last of the columns, you see the projection for 2010. So the budget situation has deteriorated rapidly, and the expectation is from the forecast that we have received is that there would be further decreases for the next year. The gap between the state revenues and expenditures have required very difficult choices to be made. So far, out of a $6 billion state general fund budget, $1 billion has been cut. Okay, so that's $1 billion out of 6. That's a lot of money. That's a huge decrease. And we've seen these effects here. At KU, we have lost 200 positions. Some of those were filled positions. And of those 200 positions, many of them were teaching positions. At Lawrence, half of the positions that we lost were teaching positions. And these have very direct and immediate consequences for us and for our students. In some instances, it means that classes are larger. In some instances, it means that classes that we would have offered cannot be offered, which will limit students' opportunities with regard to the kinds of courses they need, either electives or sometimes required courses. And the enrollment restrictions also mean that we're unable to provide opportunities for students in areas where we need to grow our enrollment and grow graduation rather than limit it. And I mentioned nursing and engineering, but there are many other areas where we know there is a need for more graduates in those areas at a time when our capacity to produce more graduates is being limited. And then because this is very close to my heart, I'll mention that one of the other academic consequences that the loss of positions and loss of faculty can have is that of prolonging the amount of time it takes our students to get their degrees. So if their classes are not available in the areas that students need, or there's not space, then there is another reason that can contribute to a longer graduation, as well as lack of academic support that can also come from staff losses. The budget cuts also put an upward pressure on tuition. If we think about if we had another chart here that looked at the relationship between tuition and the state general fund portion of our budget, you will see a direct opposite relationship. The more the state funding goes down, in order to get the resources that we need, the higher the tuition has to go. But these, in addition to having negative effects on our academic programs, in addition to the economic implications for our students, the budget situation also has negative implications for the economy in Kansas, because the ability to grow our economy when the economy starts to recover depends on the quality of students and graduates who are ready to go into the field to work. You know this, I know this, the governor certainly is very aware of this, as are the legislators, key legislators, and the region. So what I'm saying is not something that only we know or we're concerned about. There is a concern. So there are many people who are in our corner, and I think they'll do everything to support us. It's clear that the economy is going to take longer to recover than many expected and forecast a year ago, and there are still difficult choices ahead. And there are going to still be difficult conversations next semester when the legislature begins. All of these topics are going to be part of the debate. Our goal, in the meantime, is to try to maintain the core mission of the university, and we recognize that we're trying to do this at a time where our resources are challenged more than ever. And so in the next months, our work is going to require a great deal of patience and a great deal of perseverance. And I've asked the others who are with me today to join to provide some more details about the implications of the economy for the planning on campus, for coming challenges within the legislature. And first, Danny Anderson is going to speak to these items.
Great, thank you. If those in the back want to come forward and sit their seats up here on the front, if that would be comfortable for you. When I look at the kind of situation that the Chancellor's just described, the way that I would say where we are is that the University of Kansas is facing some of the largest planning challenges that we've had since World War II. We're really going to be going through changes, and I hope my comments convey to you the seriousness of the situation that we're in as we look at ways that we're trying to actively and responsibly respond to these challenges. The choices that we make right now, I think this is a key piece to remember. All of the challenges we're looking at are not one-year situations. We're looking at multiple years of challenge financially in our state, and we need to be thinking as a university, if we've gone through declines last year, we're experiencing it this year, if it happens again next year, and as we look at the projections, there is some concern that we're looking at 2 or 3 years. How do we think in terms of that bigger picture so that we are moving forward to be as strong as we possibly can and have a basis for moving into a recovery when things begin to improve? And so I'd say I would encourage you to think about what is KU as a public research university? How do we ensure that that mission remains viable as we move into the future? Several points that I'd like for you to think about just to consider the seriousness of the situation that we're in. I would emphasize the point that Bernadette already mentioned, that the state has had to cut almost $1 billion out of a $6 billion state general fund. That magnitude is very significant when we look at where we are in terms of our context. The other piece that you may want to look at is the backside of the handout that you have. When you look at this is comparing expenditures and receipts. The line with the triangles in it shows that we're still expecting a further decline in terms of the receipts in fiscal year 2011. And a lot of what I want to be talking about is how do we plan for fiscal year 2011, fiscal year 2012, looking forward as we're moving into that situation when the state will be struggling to have resources to meet all of its needs. Just to summarize briefly, I think it's really important as we think about the context, where are we? At the start of the current fiscal year, 2010, we had already, as a university, implemented base cuts that dealt with a 10% reduction in the state general fund. In July, the very beginning of the fiscal year, we started with another 2% reduction, bringing that to a total of 12% in the state general fund support to KU. Then last Monday, November 2009, the governor announced additional allotments, and those included specifically $2 million, plus there's an additional $5 million bond that is involved in higher ed. So we're looking at the state higher ed system finding a way to confront a $7 million additional cut. And so a portion of that will be passed along to KU. We have not yet received specific information from the Board of Regents about how much of that we will be looking at, but those amounts factor into everything that we're looking at in terms of where are we right now. At present, we're responding to the July and the November allotments, and we're planning for the fiscal year 2011 budget. So I've got this 12% overall reduction plus whatever this additional amount is. And I want to give you some of the ideas about kinds of assumptions that we must use when we begin to make plans to shape the fiscal year 2011 budget. First of all, we've accelerated the timeline that we usually follow for working on our budget. We think this is important because we need to be ready to explain to the Board of Regents, to our state legislature, what would be the impact if there are additional cuts to KU. And we can only do that by moving ahead with the planning to think about how we really know what would happen to us. And there's one quotation that I want to read here. This is from the governor's November 24th press release regarding where we are. And here's a quote. "We have passed the point of crippling cuts. The cuts I had to make the latest round are so severe that basic state functions are now in jeopardy. In some areas, such as education, it is clear that if revenues do not recover, we will see permanent damage done to our most critical assets." So given that kind of scenario, some of the assumptions that we're working with is one, in a best case scenario, the fiscal year 2011 state contribution to our budget is going to remain flat. So wherever we are at the end of cuts in 2010, that is what we ought to be looking at as we move forward in 2011. So to date, that means looking at the additional $2.7 million cut that came out in July, that's a 2%, plus whatever our portion of the most recent allotment is. One of the things that is important to remember is where we are right now is the floor established in terms of 2006 funding for education that makes us eligible as a state for stimulus funding from the federal government. We've hit that floor, and our hope would be that our state is able to maintain support at that level so we do not go any lower than that. So that is one of the assumptions, how we look at that flat funding moving forward. A second assumption that you have experienced personally, but you may not have thought about this institutionally, is many fringe benefit costs are going up. You all thinking about your personal cost for health insurance next year know that you'll be paying more. As an employer, the university will also be making an increasing contribution to that, to the tune of we have to make $2.3 million additional dollars in payment to provide health insurance. So that is something that without additional funding, we're looking at how do we deal internally with covering that cost. Assumption number 3 is an uncertainty. Demographics in the Midwest are changing. There are fewer students graduating from high schools each year, and the number is expected to decline a little bit over the next decade, which means that we are all working harder to ensure that we have stability in our enrollments. When you look at the financial situation today, one of the questions that we all have is that there are many out-of-state students who may be choosing to remain closer to home because it may be more economical for them. There may be students who are choosing to begin their first couple of years at community colleges. So it leaves us with a question mark. What will our enrollment be? And we have to simply plan for adjustments in enrollment as part of the way of moving forward. We also are very proactively looking at things that we can do both to recruit students and to retain the students we have. So this is a kind of unknown as we look at how do we move forward in terms of planning activities. So given those various assumptions, that scenario that I say means that our situation is serious, I want to give you some ideas about the kind of things that we're doing. First of all, as I talk with vice provosts, with deans, and as I meet with governance leaders, one of my key messages is that we must be thinking in terms of multi-year perspectives as we plan. It is not going to be sufficient for us to think about 1 year to the next being all that we need to do. We've got to think about where we want to be a few years out and how the choices today are going to shape our ability to get to that point. One of the questions is, what is it that really makes KU strong as a public research university? What do we need to be doing to protect those core strengths? Because they're going to be the basis for our recovery a few years from now when the financial situation begins to improve. Second, there are specific kinds of questions that I've been discussing with vice provosts, with deans, sharing with governance leaders about the kinds of things that we need to ask in order to protect those core strengths of our university. One of them, this is a hard reality. Last summer, when I was asked a question about this, I said, we're not there yet. Now I think we're at a place where we need to start talking about how can we answer this question. And it means that we have to look at all kinds of programs at KU. And I'm using the word program both to refer to academic programs, to different kinds of business programs, support programs, every kind of activity that we engage in to decide what should we continue to do, and are there areas where we need to pull back and decide we cannot provide everything at the same level, and we have to make some priorities in terms of what it is we're going to do. This could mean that either some activities would be reorganized or that we might have some activities that would be eliminated. Many state agencies around us are asking hard questions about their programs, and KU is not any different. When you look at our academic programs at KU, it's been 17 years since we went through a process where we actually identified programs we felt like were no longer meeting our current needs and that we wanted to reorganize or eliminate them. If we consider eliminating or reducing or reorganizing an academic program, our governance guidelines give us very explicit procedures about the way that we must do that. So we're not talking about changing that or modifying that, but we do need to make honest assessments and decisions about how will we keep investing in the programs that help us move forward in an effective manner as a university. The second thing that I've talked about, and I hope that all of you were able to check your emails this morning, we had a furlough development policy committee that was looking at how could KU respond to the possibility of the state mandating furloughs on our campus. And we felt like if there were mandatory furloughs, we would like to be in a position to say that we have a plan as a campus about a way that we could meet our furlough targets that would be effective for the operations of a university. And so that was the origin of this plan. We had a committee that worked on making recommendations. We've spent time reviewing those recommendations to make certain that they complied with all state and federal guidelines. And the policy that was posted today and that you received an email about is the set of recommendations, it's the policy that came out of that process of those recommendations. And I feel like it is a very faithful policy based on the kind of recommendations that were made. The key points that I want you to remember is the state has not mandated furloughs for state employees right now. KU, as we look at our current budget situation, we do not envision using furloughs in the current fiscal year if all of the assumptions continue to hold true. The thing that I would recommend that you think about is that furloughs are a temporary tool to help you get to a long-term planning goal. Depending upon where things go in future years, it is important to think about furloughs as a possible tool that we might need to protect the university in terms of accomplishing the goal of maintaining our strengths as we move into the future. And the last thing, I guess there are two other things I want to mention. In the summer, during the budget forum, I was asked, as we look at the financial constraints that we're addressing, does this mean that KU is looking at financial exigency? The answer, again, is no. We are not looking at financial exigency. If you look at the kind of reductions that we're facing, they're similar to the magnitudes and cuts that many universities have faced other places, and other places have faced much larger cuts. We are going through the kind of planning that ensures that we're being effective as a university in maintaining all of our resources. We are not in any way at the point that an institution would be when they're considering those kinds of drastic declarations. The other piece that the Chancellor mentioned is tuition. And I think it's important to emphasize that as we look forward to where we'll be in 2011, we have to ask the question, what is the appropriate level that we should recommend to the regents for them to set our tuition? When we are looking at that question, we're thinking about the tuition compact. What can we do to continue ensuring that kind of predictability of higher education cost for our students and their families? What are we looking at in terms of ensuring that the cost of a KU education remains competitive with our peer institutions? And it is actually a larger debate that is going on when we think about tuition in terms of how does the state help support public education versus what are we asking families and students to provide in terms of financing public education through tuition. And that is a big debate that is going on not just in Kansas but around the country. So I want to close by recommending that there are three things that you could think about doing when you look at all of this situation. First, when you are called upon in different ways to think about participating in recruitment of students is a university-wide activity. I know that many departments get calls from student success or from admissions and scholarships to talk with a student, meet with them. Look at that invitation as being something that really makes a big difference in the life of our university, the kind of image of welcoming that we give to every student. As we look at the next years, being certain that we're successful in recruitment is really important. The second thing is, especially if you're working with freshman or sophomore students or have transfer students who are new to KU, we really want to ensure that those students are succeeding and coming back for a second year. Retention is one of the ways that we really can ensure the success of our students and also stability in terms of our student numbers as we're planning. Right now, we have task forces that are looking at these issues, and one of the numbers that KU is not unusual in this regard, but we think we can do a whole lot better. If 1 out of 5 first-time, full-time freshmen right now doesn't come back for a second year, that is a big loss. Things that we can do to intervene, identify those students, many of them are in good academic standing, and keep them here at KU is important. And I know many of you are in contact with students and can help reach out to them in ways to keep them here. And the last thing that I think you really need to do throughout the spring 2010 legislative session is be informed. It's going to be a time when our citizen legislators are going to be facing really hard decisions. They're looking at the question of how do they provide funding for an incredible number of important services in the state? How do they fund public higher education? How do they consider the difficult choices about ways to enhance revenue so that they can do that? Be informed. Watch that discussion. I think it is very important that we stay abreast of all that is going on. And so for the next portion of the budget forum, I'm going to ask Kathy Damron, our Director of State Government Relations, to give you an update about what is going on.
Great. Thank you very much, Danny. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I want to talk just briefly about 3 things. 1, the legislative process, which will begin January 11th. 2, what those of us here have been engaged in the last couple of months, advocating on behalf of the university, and 3, what we hope you'll be able to join us in doing in the next few months. The legislature will come back to session in Topeka January 11th, and on the 11th, we also anticipate hearing from the governor in his State of the State address, where he will set his priorities for the state, unveil his budget priorities, and give lawmakers a roadmap for how to arrive at that destination. He has said repeatedly that it is his intention to hold both higher education and K-12 public education spending at the level where we are now, which is to say the 2006 base funding levels, so as not to jeopardize the federal stimulus dollars that the state of Kansas has received, and also to do no further harm to an important state investment. So certainly we appreciate the strong leadership that we've gotten from Governor Parkinson, from his administration, and from his budget director, because when you cut $1 billion off of a state budget base of $6 billion, it's very hard when public education makes up nearly 70% of that not to go very deep in finding ways to shrink those dollars to public education. But they've managed to do that in ways that are rather stunning and remarkable. So we owe them a great deal of gratitude for that. When lawmakers come to Topeka, we anticipate that really, once again, everything will be on the table. What they didn't do last year really was engage in very serious discussion about new revenue. They felt that they needed to first take a serious look at finding ways to reduce government spending. So rather than engaged in a lot of discussion about tax policy or ways to increase resources to the state treasury, they really focused on ways to balance the budget through spending cuts. In the last probably 6 weeks, the tenor of the conversation with lawmakers has really changed. They have now been much more verbal in discussing their ideas and openness to looking at ways in which some of the more recently enacted tax credits or sales tax exemptions, the policies that they've enacted that have shrunken the base of state funding maybe need to be re-examined. The Chancellor and I were at a forum yesterday in Overland Park, and one of the leading Republicans on the House Tax Committee was actually rather remarkable in his comments when he talked about the ways in which he, as a Republican, would really, and a very pro-business Republican, thinks that there needs to be an examination of that. So I think you're going to see a state legislature that will look at everything again next year. They'll look at the budget in the traditional sort of 3 phases that they normally do. They'll have to enact what they call a supplemental budget for this current year, some additions, some subtractions to it. With more people being unemployed, that puts more pressure on what we call the human caseloads, the people who are on unemployment and need social service assistance. So there'll be additions to that budget. There'll be subtractions to some of the other budgets. So that will be enacted in the first couple of weeks of the session. Then the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee break down into their subcommittees. They'll spend almost all of February looking at the 2011 budget numbers in those subcommittees. They'll wrap that up in March. Both houses will pass a version of the budget and send it to the governor. The legislature then, if you'll remember, takes a break in April for a couple of weeks, during which time the revenue estimators that work for the state come together and examine what's going on in the state's economy. They update the budget estimate in order for lawmakers to come back the end of April and do an omnibus budget bill where there will be some additions to budgets, there'll be some subtractions to budgets. And ultimately, what will happen is, I believe, a budget bill will pass the end of April or the 1st of May, along with some sort of a revenue bill. So we will have, from this point through the 1st of May, a great deal of anxiety. You'll read a lot in the newspaper about what's going on. I would really encourage you to stay abreast of the developments in Topeka, and there are a couple of great ways to do that. We will post weekly updates on the Government Relations webpage. And also, I would very much encourage your participation in our leading advocacy effort, which is Jayhawks for Higher Education. And on the back table, which you may have picked up when you came in, there is a one-page flyer which gives you the web address to sign up for the Jayhawks for Higher Education Advocacy Network, as well as the Government Relations webpage. So with that, I'm going to throw it open for questions. There are microphones in the back. We do have Diane Goddard here, who is our Vice Provost for Finance, so if it gets into really complicated math questions, we have to throw it to Diane. And thank you all very much.
Yeah, I noticed, I'm Sean Saving with Kansas Geological Survey. I noticed the furlough policy today was released, and there was no mention of the 403B retirement plans. I think we all agree that it's a good idea to be saving for retirement. As you know, employees match contribute mandatory contribution of 5.5% to our retirement plan. The university matches 8.5%. It would seem to me that if we're going to consider furloughs, for those people that are furloughed, that rather than taking money away from their take-home pay, they'd be given the option to defer that 5.5% of their mandatory their contribution to the retirement plan. I know a lot of folks would much rather make their mortgage payment this month than worry about their retirement, which given the stock market, we may or may not see 30 years from now anyway. So that would be something I'd like to see considered in the furlough policy, is that option, if that were to go into effect.
I think your suggestion is that rather than making a contribution to retirement, that the faculty and staff be allowed to say, I won't make that contribution, that's then used to pay salary instead.
Correct. That's in play in lieu of the say it's a 5% furlough cut. You say, okay, well, I don't work an extra day, but rather than taking a 5% cut in my take-home pay, I don't put 5.5% into my retirement account. Okay. That would, at least have that option to do that. Some people might want to still say I can take the cut, but other people might say, look, I can't. I need that take-home money. I can't see any reduction in that.
So no, that would be something that the state would have to decide on.
Right.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean we can't go ahead and explore that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that would take one of two changes, either a change in state law to allow it, or at the very least a change in policy at the Board of Regents. But let us explore what options are available and what tools we would need. Thank you for your question.
Hi, thanks for sharing all this information with us. I'm Paul Kelton from the History Department. The stimulus money that the state receives for higher education stipulates that state funding can't fall below 2006 levels. How long does that stay in existence, that stipulation? Would that be in existence for fiscal year 2011?
Yes, if the state avails itself of that stimulus money for 2011, then that restriction would exist then too. It goes away in 2012, and we don't know whether the program will be continued beyond that or not. There are some states that have successfully been able to receive from the federal government a waiver to that restriction. At this point, Kansas has not made that move to request a waiver that I know of. Anyway,
I'm not sure that any states have been successful. I think some have requested it, but I'm not sure that it has been granted. I heard a report yesterday that said none had been granted, but there's
okay.
So
it's a very semantic issue. Those who argue for the states getting a waiver are careful in how they present it. They would say, oh, many states have requested a waiver or are seeking a waiver, but the federal government hasn't acted on any of those requests. So whether they will or not, or whether they'll just be passive and look the other way, might be the way they politically dodge the bullet.
We have a question that was emailed. It asks whether there are any plans for salary cuts and it suggests that employees making $100,000 or more receive salary cuts either only or that they receive greater salary cuts than people making below 100,000.
We have not at present looked at implementing salary cuts for certain groups of employees. I think that the thing that's important to point out is that if you look at the furlough policy, which is a kind of temporary salary cut, it does look at the fact that employees are paid at a variety of ranges, and it does ask for employees who receive a higher salary to make a larger contribution to making up the total target that we might have to make up under those circumstances. So that kind of a philosophical principle is a part of the furlough policy as it was recommended by a governance committee from the campus.
Another email question then, which is how are other states dealing with revenue shortfalls similar to Kansas's?
I think that other states are looking at and doing all of the things that we are considering. Some states have already had furloughs. Certainly there are many places where there have been layoffs. There are universities that have closed down programs and schools. And there are universities like the University of California system that have had huge tuition increases. I think there's our 32% proposed tuition increases. So I think if you look around the country, all of the things that we are considering are also being looked at by one or more other states and universities.
To that point, we had a report last week from the Council of State Governments who appeared before the House Appropriations Committee. And in your advocacy efforts in dealing with lawmakers who might be concerned that in a time of economic distress, raising revenues would have a bad effect on the economy, you might point out that 30 other states have done that at this point. So Kansas would be in the minority, having looked at that side of the revenue equation.
Chancellor, I think in your email you said something about there may be, maybe it was Danny's email, there may be some hiring that committees that have made proposals and going to their schools with, we'd like to hire this person for next year. There may be some putting of those on hold, but yet you haven't got revenues from the latest cuts. Are there still some hiring proposals that will be acted upon for next year?
One of the things that we're doing is when we work with the deans and the vice provosts for all the different sectors and they're looking at their needs, I guess the short answer to your question is there is not a hiring freeze as such. I think each of the deans, vice provosts, looking at the choices they have to make are trying to decide, given retirements or resignations and the need to keep certain areas of their operations going, they may choose to move forward and complete a search that is underway. So in that sense, it's not an easy question. As we look at what are we going to do in terms of looking forward to the fiscal year 2011 budget, as we know more, there is a chance that as we move through the year, different groups will decide they are not going to proceed with some of those choices. But I think that has to be looked at as a strategy decision that has to be made based on what it takes to move forward in an effective way during a challenging time.
Can you give us an idea of the magnitude of savings that a furlough makes? I mean, for example, if the entire university staff were furloughed for one day, how much money would be saved by that?
One thing that I would say is when we look at a furlough, the way that we would approach it is if we are asked by the state or if we realize we have to meet a certain amount, we would use that target to figure out how would we develop a furlough around it. And we do not have a specific amount to know. But I know that Diane, as a kind of experiment, looked at one point to try and figure out what would it take for one day, and I don't know if you have that information at hand.
That ranged from what we called one round of furloughs, which ranged depending on the tier that you fell in, anywhere from 1 to 5 days for those folks at the highest level. And I believe that that was going to generate between 5 and 6 million. 7 million? 6 million. Yeah, okay. Okay. Thank you, Richard. 6.6 million. So, but I haven't looked at what would one day for everybody generate.
Since we're on the topic of furloughs, we have a couple of questions here can fold together, and it's regarding the policy and whether and specifics on that. One of them is that it mentions that either furloughs and or salary reductions, how would that be determined, which would be chosen? And the rest is whether people would be required to report to work and whether they could choose the time that they would be gone.
Preface this by saying at this point, because we don't have an absolute or even a planned furlough target, I can talk philosophically about how we would approach some of those questions. For exempt faculty and staff, those staff that are not subject to overtime, we could allow you to either take a salary reduction and spread it out over a longer period of time, or you could take your furlough days and then that salary reduction would be compressed into when you took your actual furlough days. We're trying to provide as much personal choice for people. Some people can't or wouldn't be able to afford to take 2 or 3 furlough days at a stipulated point in time. But if we had a long period of time in which to spread that out, if we could give you your target amount and then have you spread it out over many pay periods, it might be easier for an individual to handle. That's a choice that will have to be made between the department head and the individual.
I think part of that question is it a furlough, which means not working and not being paid, or is it a salary reduction, which means being paid less but working? I think that's part of the question.
If you take furlough days, you cannot work. If you were to opt into taking a salary reduction spread over multiple pay periods, then you would stay exempt, and for most of us, we would work our 40-plus hours as we normally do. So it's just 2 different ways to get to the same end.
Therese Tonis from the KU Writing Center, Student Success. Would furlough savings revert to individual departments or centrally?
It depends on the source of funding. Obviously, if we're doing a furlough, it's because we need to generate money temporarily to put towards our budget cuts. So if your position is being funded from either state appropriated money or tuition money, what we call our general use money, yes, that money will be swept and will be put towards the budget cut. If you're partially funded on a grant, or if you are funded by housing, or then that money, you will still have to have your furlough, but that money would reside within the unit. Did I answer your question so that you can, okay.
We have another emailed question. It says that KU has a policy of setting a January date for non-reappointment notices, And the emailer says that this doesn't seem to be in the collective best interest of the personnel and the university, and asks whether some sort of change on the non-reappointment notice to a shorter time frame is being considered.
Do you want to take that?
One of the policies that we have at KU in terms of notices of non-reappointment is in one of our governance guidelines is that we provide notice in mid-January for a position that may end at the end of the fiscal year. That's basically giving a person about 6 months notification. That is remarkably long compared to most other kinds of operations. Last year we did have to give notices of non-reappointment, and it created significant loss of morale in the units for a very long period of time. It's interesting when you look at KU, we have different personnel policies for different parts of the university. The medical center uses a date that is in March, which, given the timeline for development of the next year's budget, means that we have much more information before we start issuing notices of non-reappointment. And I have heard several people mention in recent days, is there something that we could do internally looking at this KU policy that we have created ourselves to consider a way that we might change that? And so that is something that I can discuss with different governance leaders if that is something that they want to consider. The other piece of this that I think is important to remind everyone is that when we issued our annual notifications of salary, sent out reappointment letters, and our new appointment letters for employees, we are reminding everyone that in times of financial constraints like we are under right now, we do not always follow that January deadline, that there may be notices of non-reappointment that come at other times during the year, and that we do everything we can to provide significant advanced notification for them. But it's a dilemma in terms of this policy that is putting us in trying to make hard and fast decisions about sending out non-reappointment notices in just a few weeks, when the reality is we're not going to have a lot of pieces of the information until mid-March or later, and that is something that we're just not quite in sync with our internal policy and the way the external calendar works in terms of where we're going.
We might have time for maybe one more.
Question about student retention. In the past, it's been known that students from certain states could come here on our out-of-state tuition that was less than their in-state. Now, is that being looked at all, or would we be in danger of losing that advantage for certain students if we raised our out-of-state tuition too much?
I'm not aware of the specific relationship between our out-of-state and in-state tuition at other places, but I think in general, whenever you're considering increasing tuition, it has to be considered not only in relationship to the resources that we need, but what the effect would be on students' decisions to come here. So we don't want to have tuition increases that would be so large that they would lose us student enrollment, because then that takes resources down. So in looking at tuition increases, the model of what the market is like and what our competitors are like, all of those things would need to be considered.
One thing that I could add is that we do carefully monitor exactly the kind of information that you're describing. We go out and look at our peers, the competing institutions, the states where students are coming from, and we're comparing exactly that kind of information to think about what is the appropriate tuition to be establishing for KU. The other kind of piece that we look at is what are other states around us or other competitors assessing in terms of tuition and fees for different kinds of professional schools. There are some parts of our university where we are an incredible bargain compared to many other universities, and trying to think about ways that strategically we identify the benchmarks so that we are both providing a very good value in terms of a KU education, but that we are not asking a price that undervalues what we have to offer. That is something that we actively monitor and we factor into the decision making.
I want to thank you all for coming today, both those who came here and those of you who are watching online. We're going to try to keep you informed in the sense that we'll provide information as we get information. And in between the times that we might have forums such as this, again, I invite you to go to the website and to click on the budget link there and provide updated information that we will, again, present as we know more information. And we will send out campus messages whenever we plan to have forums in the future. Again, thank you so much. And if anyone has a specific question that we didn't get to, we'll stick around for a few minutes so that you can ask that question, but I know that many of you have 1 o'clock appointments. Thank you again and have a good day.